Alright, now I'm going to mount this 70mm throttle body from 505. Gasket on, get that throttle positioned right, and screw with blue Loctite and washer. Get them all in there and started. Alright, with these all snugged on, you want to tighten them between 5 and 10 foot-pounds or between 60 and 120 inch-pounds. You're just trying to squash this little gasket down just a little bit in the aluminum, so be careful. But with Loctite on there going into aluminum, it's not going to loosen up. Just get a little bit of pressure on there and you're good. Here's a Mopar throttle position sensor. I'm going to line up these tabs, slight angle, twist it into place, start the screws. I take a T20 Torx, just get them in until they're nice and snug. Here's the coolant temperature sensor. You want to tighten it down in there until these threads bite in nice and tight. Don't over tighten it, just get it good and snug. On sensors that have a tapered thread and sealant on them, I like to get them to where they're snug and then continue to tighten them until it's to a point where the electrical connector can easily be squeezed and removed in the future. And this is the intake air temperature sensor. Same thing, snug it in and tighten it to where the connector is easy to remove. That should work nicely. So here's the idle air control valve or motor. Comes with this O-ring and these two screws. So the O-ring you want to slip onto the tip. And then you want to slide it into the socket so that you can plug in the wiring easy. And then there's these two T20 Torx that go in top and bottom. They've got thread locker on them. Alright, now for the map sensor. This prong on the throttle body connects to this little prong on the bottom of the map sensor, but you need a little rubber elbow for that. Here's that part number. Those suckers kind of hard to track down. Fits on here like so. And then plug this bottom part in. And then two T20 Torx hold it into the throttle body. Just get these snug. This is the 90-degree adapter for the oil pressure sending unit. Screws in here with a little bit of this thread sealant. And you want it to end up facing this way so that the sending unit faces back towards the bell housing. I painted this thing, so I'm going to go easy on it. Normally it takes a 1-inch wrench. I'm going to put a 1 1/16 on there with a little paper towel to protect the paint and snug it down. So it's getting pretty snug here. I'm just going to continue another quarter turn and get it facing the right direction. And that should do it. This is the oil pressure sending unit, and it comes with a factory installed thread sealant on there. If you're using your own thread sealant on there, make sure not to get it past the tip. You don't want any of that stuff getting in your oil system. And screw it in, and when you get it tight, you want to get it to the point where you can remove the electrical connector easy. It's getting pretty snug, so I'm just going to stop right about here and make it easy to put that connector on. Now I'm going to install the dipstick. This is the stud that mounts it to the block. It's also the stud for the ground for the PCM and TCM. So you got to make sure that these threads are perfectly clean, as well as the threads in the block. I'm also going to use some of this copper anti-seize to get a little bit better connection in there. You don't get a good connection, you're going to have electrical gremlins. You can see where it slides in. It's a little bit beveled and raised right here. It's a press fit, so you want to make sure you get that seated down in there or you're going to leak a little bit of oil. Drop a bolt in. And then grab your trusty block of wood, smack that bolt. Done. Copper anti-seize and a E7 socket. Tighten that sucker in there nice and snug. I'm just going to put the nut on for after the engine install. A little bit of copper anti-seize. and the dipstick. So I was going to set up top dead center before putting the spark plugs in, and I noticed that this harmonic balancer does not have any timing marks on it. So, Mopar harmonic balancer with the timing mark. Just need to swap that sucker out. One thing that I screwed up putting the timing cover on was this bolt right here. It's actually supposed to be a stud for the alternator mounting bracket. So, 3 3/8/16 lock nuts and 1 3/8/16 bolt. This part number's for a 2000 Cherokee. It'll be different for a 2001 or earlier years, but that's the O'Reilly house brand lifetime warranty on that thing. And it looks like there's plenty of clearance in here for the plug and for the main stud. This is the bracket for the AC compressor and the fan clutch. I put a new bearing in there, gave it a fresh coat of paint. When you push this flange on, make sure that it's not in too close to the main bracket, because you won't have enough clearance for your pulley against the timing cover. So it goes on with 4 bolts. It's easier to get this one in first, and then kind of sneak it on. 3 here, and you're good. This is where you can run into clearance issues with this pulley. Make sure it clears the timing cover, and also the alternator bracket. I had to take a crescent wrench and just kind of barely bend it down. It was just slightly scraping the edge of this pulley. Alright, so get that pulley on there. Then you want to mount the fan to the fan clutch using Loctite, and the small edge of the rivet faces the motor, the flat smooth side faces the radiator. When this goes on, you want to make sure that you're using locking nuts. If you don't, they can loosen up and that fan will just launch right up into your radiator and ruin your day. You can slip a screwdriver in to hold it while you tighten these up. When you mount the AC compressor on, make sure to put anti-seize on the end of the bolts. They'll get frozen in there pretty easily. If you're having a hard time finding a set of these, you can pick them up at the local hardware store. They're size M8 by 1.25 by 110 in length. Here's the water pump pulley, and you want to make sure to use some of that blue Loctite on these. You don't need these bolts loosening up at all. Here's the part number for the bolts. The tensioner pulley adjusting screw, and I got this extra thick grade 8 washer at Ace. Slip this sucker on there, gives it a little something extra to spin around on the top. It's going to screw into this, but we got to put a lot of anti-seize on the threads just so it moves easily. So it's going to want to screw in like this, in behind there. Slip it in. Pulley, slip in the bushing. This one's got a little paint on it, so it's going to stick a little bit. It'll sandwich in there with the bolt. Slip the bolt in. Back side, you want to use a little bit of a washer, a little spacer against that collar on the bearing, just to keep it off of this area of the bearing. And then your spacer, keep it away from the bracket. Let's slip that in there. Feed it into your adjusting nut down there. Zip it in. Here's the power steering pump, and these are the bolts that go with it. You want to make sure to loosen up the bolts on the bracket so that you have a little bit of give between here and the intake manifold. Makes it easier to line up. So you want to slip this in, and then through the hole in the pulley. I'm going to go through the hole in the power steering pump and into the intake manifold. With that bolt holding it in place, you can run a little bit of anti-seize on these bolts. I'm reusing this power steering pump because it had relatively low miles on it when I took it out. And these plastic pulleys are prone to cracking here and splitting between the holes here. So I'm going to replace that with this billet aluminum pulley from PSC. It's an underdrive pulley, 4.5 inch outside diameter, and it should generate a little bit more speed out of the pump, give me a little bit more power at low RPM. Just going to pull it out of the package, give it a coat of paint, and stick it on. Good to go. Now I'm going to set top dead center. So rotating the crank, I'll watch that notch on the harmonic balancer and line it up with 0 right there. But that could also be the top of the exhaust stroke. Here's how to find out. Put your finger over spark plug hole number 1, rotate the crank until that notch lines up with 0. If your finger's getting blown off of there with some compression, that's a compression stroke, that's top dead center. If not, you're on the exhaust stroke. Another way you can do it is to lightly thread one of your spark plugs into the hole. Get it down in there a good ways, but don't seat it. That way when you rotate it around, you can actually hear the air blowing past the threads. With that spark plug in there, I'm going to rotate it and listen. Can hear it hissing out now. And that's top dead center. Also gets kind of hard to turn. Edelbrock's website recommends an RC12YC spark plug or equivalent. They need a 14mm by 3/4 inch reach. I picked this one up because the RC12YC reads as a small engine spark plug, and I didn't want to go that route with this motor. These are supposed to be tightened between 26 and 30 foot-pounds. I also put a little bit of copper anti-seize on there, help protect the threads in the head. All right, now for the coil pack. You want to use dielectric grease in each one of these spark plug boots. Gets you better connection and helps you pull it off in the future. Put a healthy amount in there. Doesn't hurt to put some in the electrical connector too. More anti-seize on the threads on the coil pack bolts and tighten them to 21 foot-pounds. Finish putting these motor mounts in. Make the stud face inward and the open hole facing outward. Now it's time to install the injectors in the rail. These are 24-pound Ford injectors. They've got a 6-hole tip on them. Pretty nice. Just slip them right in. And then with the connector facing away from you, take the horseshoe clip and slip it right into the groove. Snap it on. Before I install the rail, I'm going to add a couple parts to prevent heat soak. Basically kind of a hard laminated aluminum shield with a little doodad to hold it on. Just lay the rail in place. You can see it can be done without even moving it. Just kind of slip it on in over the studs. And then this little guy punches in right here to hold it down. And that keeps the heat from coming up through the intake manifold from the exhaust and vaporizing fuel in injector number 3 especially. And the second part of the heat soak protection is spark plug boot protectors. We'll slip them up and over the injector, cut them to length so that they'll fit perfectly down up and over the intake manifold opening. Alright, got them on there looking good, and this is the part number for the 4 bolts to hold the injector rail on. And this grounding stud is to prevent radio whine from your alternator. I just installed this plug with some thread sealant in the back of the head. This is where the coolant temperature sensor would plug in on, I believe, a pre-96 setup. And bolt on the throttle cable bracket. Now the belt. A Cherokee would normally use a 60950, but since I'm using this 4.5 inch diameter power steering pulley, I'm going with the 60935. I just put in 6 quarts of this, and it's right in the middle of the operating range. So I'm going to prime the oil system and check it again. This is a distributor for a 4-liter minus the cam gear. So I can slip it right in and drive that oil pump using a drill. Now I'm going to set up the camshaft synchronizer, which is basically the distributor for coil packs. It comes with a sensor bolted to the top of it and this little gasket for the bottom. It also comes with an alignment tool. pull the sensor off, and this little pulse ring inside wants to be lined up right on that leading edge right there. That's where this tool is going to fit in. Just like that. So now we want to line this thing up in the hole. We want to line this blade up with the slot in the oil pump. As the distributor goes in, we want it to end up like this, but with these gears, we need to put it in at an angle so that it'll eventually end up like that as it seats down in there. So starting off, we're going to want that oil pump to be at somewhere around 11 o'clock. Right now I'd say it's around 8 o'clock. So I'm going to put a long flathead screwdriver down in there and rotate it to about 11. Alright, so I laid the gasket down on there. I'm going to slip the sucker in there at a slight angle. Let it drop on in. That's about right. With the alignment tool in place, put the hold down clamp on and tighten it down. You're only going until it's snug. It's just to keep this from rotating. So take the alignment tool off. You'll notice this edge is lined up perfectly. You want to tighten the sensor down just until this rubber O-ring's getting some pressure on it. It doesn't take a lot of torque, just make sure that you tighten it down evenly and put enough pressure onto that rubber O-ring so it'll be sealed.